Okay, hi there, my name's Stephen Hamil and I'm Innovation Director here at MBS. And what we try and do in sort of this part of our building is every 3 or 4 months have a sort of breakfast seminar. And we've had some like notable names in the past. We had Mark Bew talking about the UK BIM mandate here about a year and a half ago. We had Adam Matthews talking about the EU BIM task group. And then today I thought we'd go from UK to Europe to ISO Global with Paul Shillcock, who's over the years been author of the 1192 series of BIM standards, and like hot off the press now, 19650 BIM standards. So we're going to have a presentation of Paul. I've got a presentation as well on the latest updates on Uniclass, and then there'll be networking opportunities downstairs in the cafe area if you want to stay a little bit longer, have a cup of coffee, some biscuits, or what have you. So I'm just going to switch presentations now and then swap seats with Paul.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Cool, thanks. So this morning, what I'd like to talk to you about is the new ISO 19650 series of standards. But before I do, I just want to highlight to a lot of you who've already aligned your business processes to the UK 1192 series, and just to highlight the global opportunity really. In terms of those of you in the room who work on international projects and international assets, the hard work that you've put in terms of getting to grips with the UK 1192 standards and all that knowledge and experience that you've gained over the years is really going to set you apart from the competition. Even as a small organisation in Opram who provide advisory services and education around the business processes for the management of information, around 75% of our business is already international. So really, I think one of the key things to take away from this morning is that the ISO 19650 series has really created that level playing field. And there's an opportunity for the UK construction industry as a whole to take advantage of that and take advantage of the work that's been done to date and the knowledge and experience that has been gained. So I guess a simple message really to the UK construction industry is to, hey, let's not blow it. And to be fair, we've got a bit of a track record of blowing it. For those of you old enough to remember, back in 1787, we invented the rules of cricket, only for other countries to get better at it than us. In 1863, we invented the rules of association football, only for other countries to get better at it than us. Likewise, in 1871, for rugby, for those of you rugby fans, we invented the rules of rugby, only for other countries to get better at it than us. And over the past decade or so, we've invented the rules for how to manage information effectively through the delivery and operational phase of assets. Okay, and as I say, ISO 19650 presents that global opportunity for us. So, just before I start, having learned lessons from the past in terms of doing this presentation, I just want to get a feel in the room really for those of you who are already familiar with the UK 1192 series. So without trying to make too many assumptions that everybody in the room is already au fait. Can I just have a quick show of hands for those of you who are working with those? Okay, oh great. Okay, so most of you in the room. I think one of the sessions that we did that was a bit flat because people were there. Hadn't really been working with 1192, but if you have, that's great. So what I'm going to do really is just take you through how the standards came about, some of the challenges that we faced in terms of the development and trying to get an international consensus, but also what this now means for those of you, as I say, who have already aligned your business processes to the UK 1192 series. So one of the first questions that I get asked is around, well, why? Why did we need a set of international standards? And I think initially there was a perception that this was about the UK thinking they were the best at everything and trying to force this onto the international community. Okay, well, it was actually the complete opposite. From the government construction strategy in 2016 and the development of the UK 1192 series and the benefits or perceived benefits that the BIM Level 2 was going to provide, we saw a number of international clients start to specify the use of those standards on their projects. Okay, predominantly, I guess, in the Middle East, Australia in particular, who were sort of saying, well, okay, there's a way of working that it can demonstrate real business benefits. So we want our supply chain and our delivery teams to work in that way also. And it was the international community that felt this was a bit unfair. Okay, it was a bit unfair that they were being asked to bid and deliver projects in accordance with UK standards. So they actually went to ISO and said, this really needs to be an international series of standards to create that level playing field. So who developed the ISO 19650 series? Well, I guess the correct answer is ISO TC 59 SC13 WG13, okay, which is basically a working group responsible for the standards relating to the implementation of collaborative working over the asset lifecycle. And this particular working group is the convener is in Norway. Sorry, the secretariat is from Norway, but in terms of the convener was Dr. Anne Kemp from the UK, and then there's myself and David Church as the lead authors for the ISO 19650. But within that working group, there was representatives from a number of different countries actively involved in the development of the 1192 series, and it was this working group were responsible for getting a consensus on what the standards were before they went up or they went back out for vote by each of the member bodies. I think an important one in the bottom right is the EU. So CEN, which is the European standards body, as a collective, we're also actively involved in the development. And partway through the development process, we were pleased that CEN, as the European standards body, agreed to adopt the ISO 19650 series as a set of European standards. So what that means is, for those of you who work on, well, for now, publicly funded projects in the UK, but also publicly funded projects across Europe that come under the Open Journal of the European Union, or OJEU, you will be required to work in accordance with ISO 19650 in terms of delivering those projects. So I guess the big question, or the million-dollar question, is, so what's changed? Okay, for those of you familiar with the UK 1192 series, there's a little bit of apprehension really about a new set of standards and what this actually means for all the hard work that you've done previously. And I guess the short answer is not a lot. Okay, the UK 1192 series has been used as the basis, and the concepts and principles defined within them have remained. All right, but in order to get international consensus, there were some amendments made. And that really falls into three categories. One is that it needed to be restructured in order to comply with the sort of ISO editorial rules. Also, there was some amended terms, so some of the terms that we're familiar with from the UK 1192 series didn't go down too well with the international community, either because they didn't translate very well or because they had a different meaning within that region. And also, there's a few new terms which you might need to get more familiar with. So we'll just run through these quickly, just starting off on the restructuring side. And I think when you look at the restructure, we had from the UK 1192 series, we had all the raw ingredients. Okay, it was just about a case of taking all those raw ingredients and trying to convert them into the international standards. So it was a little bit like baking a cake, which then led me to the idea of the Great British Bake Off. Okay, in terms of taking those raw ingredients and baking effectively an international standard. So what we'll do is, because this is the driest subject in the world, I'm trying to make it a little bit interesting. We're going to go through as a recipe, okay, how the process is and the ingredients that have gone into each of the standards. So first up, we've got ISO 19650 Part 1, which looks at the concepts and principles for the management of information throughout the asset lifecycle. Okay, it's written as a code of practice, which means that it represents industry best practice, and you'll notice that it has the modal verb should in a lot of the clauses within it. So first up, we take the concepts and principles from BS 1192. Okay, so that's the concepts and principles around the collaborative production of information and working collaboratively as teams to provide the right information at the right time. Next, we add the concepts and principles from PAS 1192 Part 2, and that's around the effective management of information, okay, and the need for identifying the requirements for information, the planning, and the assurance activities within the process. And then, importantly, we then also added the concepts and principles from PAS 1192 Part 3. And this really was so that Part 1 covered the entire life cycle, okay, but also it was a little bit of forward planning in terms of the future development of the series. So we had all the concepts and principles from those documents, and we seasoned it with a little bit of lessons learned and best practice. So since their publication and their implementation, as an industry, we have learned a number of lessons, and a lot of those were starting to be incorporated in the alignment activities of the 1192 series. And what we did is we didn't throw that all away. We took all those lessons learned, best practice, and hopefully incorporated it within the ISO. So we got our ingredients mixed round and round in circles, and at certain points, it did feel like we were going round and round in circles. I think when we started and we met for the first time as a working group, everybody thought they were going to turn up to develop a BIM standard. Okay, but then when we started explaining that this was an information management standard, okay, they all got a little bit confused. So we had to re-educate them in terms of what it was we were trying to achieve. Okay, and this wasn't about data structure, it wasn't about technology or objects or 3D models. This is about business process and people working collaboratively. And over the development process, as more people got involved, we did constantly have to go around circles to re-educate people until we had a shared understanding. Then put it in the oven, set a timer for 4 years. So when we first met, and I was told that the average ISO takes between 5 and 7 years to develop, I thought, really? I'll have this knocked out in 6 months. Okay, but true to form, I think we were one of the fastest ISOs to get through, but even still, it took 4.5 years to get that international consensus and to go through that ISO process. And during that process, we did need to baste with a little bit of compromise. So as the authors, our task was to try and to keep the UK 1192 series as intact as possible, okay, making sure that those fundamental concepts and principles remained. And I think to a certain degree, I think we were successful in that. So that's the recipe, I guess, for ISO 19650 Part 1. So on to Part 2. So Part 2 looks at the management of information through the delivery phase of assets when using building information modelling. Okay, so it's very much aligned with PAS 1192 Part 2, but this Part 2 is being written as a specification. And as a specification, you'll see that it uses the modal verb shall, okay, in terms of somebody shall do something. Okay, so it's written hopefully in a clear and logical format. So the ingredients for Part 2, what we do now is we take the main clauses from BS 1192. Okay, so that's around the check, review, approval, authorization, and acceptance activities relating to the collaborative production of information. We then take the main clauses from PAS 1192 Part 2, which actually form the vast majority of the document. So the information delivery cycle, for those of you familiar with that, and the activities and the steps within that, you'll become, when you look at the ISO Part 2, it'll be very recognisable to you in terms of that process. Again, seasoned with some lessons learned and best practice. Mixed round and round circles. As I say, it was a bit, this is probably the most challenging thing in terms of trying to get everybody understood and the need and for each of the activities and the sequence and so on. Again, put in the oven and set a timer for 4 years. And base with compromise as necessary. And I think one of the biggest challenges we had, particularly with part 2, was because it was a specification and it had the word shall, it meant people had to do something in order to comply with it. So there was, the vast majority of the time was spent trying to understand the impact of that in each of the member bodies of ISO. Because each country and each region is very different legal frameworks, procurement routes, and contracts about how they engage with each other. So there was a few areas where we had to compromise. However, we weren't successful in getting agreement or international consensus on everything that is within the UK 1192 series. So we came up with the idea of a national annex. Okay, and the idea is that within part 2, each region or each member body of ISO can develop their own national annex, looking at the specific standards and production methods and procedures that need to be adopted within that particular region in order to implement ISO 19650 Part 2. Okay, and so consequently, as a UK, we've developed the UK National Annex. So just as a quick question, can anybody have a guess as to one of the areas that we weren't able to get an international consensus on? File name or container identification. So yeah, the emotive subject of what name do you give a container within a accommodating environment? So what we did, we took the remaining clauses from BS 1192. So what we couldn't put into part 1 or part 2, and yeah, we've got things like the naming convention and the codification for the fields within the container ID. Then we took the remaining clauses from PAS 1192 Part 2. And again, in terms of the regional specifics, and just to lead on to Stephen's presentation, there is a requirement within ISO 19650 Part 2 that all information within the accommodating environment is to be classified. In the regional annex, as in the UK National Annex, the UK implementation of that, or the classification system to be used, is Uniclass 2015. And we would anticipate in the US National Annex, for example, they would specify Uniclass, okay, as the classification system to be used. Again, season with lessons learned and best practice, mixed round and round in circles. Now, as a UK National Annex, you'd expect, and we only had to get agreement in the UK, you'd expect this was going to be fairly straightforward, right? So for a 5-page document, the first public consultation, we got over 30 pages of comments, okay. Most of which related to the fact that the annex was issued without the ISO, so it was very difficult for people to comment. But most of them, the vast majority were trying to change what was originally in the 1192 series. So we did go around circles a little bit. It didn't take as long because we only had to get the consensus for the UK, and that was around 9 months. So that's the restructuring. So what we've ended up with is ISO 19650 Part 1, Part 2, which comes with a national annex. So look in terms of the amended terms. So on the left, we've got the UK terms, which most of you will probably be familiar with. And as I say, these are some of the ones that we didn't go down too well with the international community. So the first one is BIM Level 2. All right, it's very UK specific, although it's probably recognised around the world. They didn't want anything to do with that. So we've ended up with BIM according to ISO 19650. Okay, so generally what that means is because part 2 is about the management of information, when using building information modelling, we had to define what that meant, and so it's just BIM according to ISO 19650. Next up, we have is contract. And as I say, because of some of the legal frameworks and the procurement routes within the different countries, they don't like anything to do with contracts in their standards. Okay? So consequently, we've ended up with the term appointment, which I actually think is probably a better term because we use the term contract, there is a perception that this only relates, or the process only applies when you engage through a contract. But because we've got a lot of organisations now are multinational, multidisciplinary, the process needs to be applied equally for internal appointments, just through an internal task order or whatever means. Okay, so I think appointment's probably a better term, and that's what we've gone with. So if we've got no contract, that does mean we've got no employer. Okay, so employer is a legal term that we use in the UK for one side of a contract. So what we've ended up with is the appointing party and the appointed party. All right. Now, what that means is that we haven't got the old switcheroo that we had in the PAS 1192 Part 2, where the client is the first employer, and then the lead supplier is then the employer, and then the suppliers and the employer then changes. So there is only one appointing party in the project, and then there are multiple appointed parties. If we've got no employer, we've got no employee's information requirements. Okay, so what we ended up with was exchange information requirements. Now again, I think this is probably a little bit better because I think when we had employees' information requirements, no one really knew whether it was who was the employer at any given stage. And exchange information requirements is the requirements for the information that need to be exchanged. But on the plus side, for those of you who've got the abbreviation EIR written throughout your entire documentation, it does mean you don't have to change it. Okay, the other one is file. Okay, now for those of you who have got nothing better to do than read standards, you will notice in BS 1192, a file was referred to as a container. Okay, and it was a container-based collaborative process. In PAS 1192 Part 2, everyone didn't really get on with the word container, so it was introduced as file. But in ISO 1960 Part 2, everyone preferred the term container. So we're back to the original term from BS 1192. Okay, so a container can be a file, it can also be a folder, it can be a layer, or a database. Okay, it's just a container that contains information. The information that needs to be in the container, in the UK we use the term level of definition, which is a collective term for the level of detail and level of information. And in the 19650, we've ended up with level of information need. Mainly because this had an abbreviation of LOD, which people understood as level of detail instead of level of definition. But what we've now ended up with is loin. So, but I'm not too sure which is better. But again, it's prescriptive. Okay, it's the level of information needed in the container to answer the question, to make the decision. And last but not least, we've got volume strategy. We really couldn't get the head around this term volume. And what we've ended up with is federation strategy. Okay, to try and, because the strategy is about how you're going to federate the graphical models in order to allow concurrent work and so on. So there's just some of the terms that you may need to get familiar with. Now, if you're using these, it doesn't mean you have to change. Okay, you just at some point, particularly if you're working on international projects, you will need to map to these terms. Okay. So they're the amended terms. So just looking at the new terms. So the first one is the information management function. Now, in PAS 1192 Part 2, there was an attempt to try and introduce some of the information management roles and the responsibilities assigned to it. I don't think that it worked out particularly well. I think a lot of people still struggled with the whole sort of roles and job titles type sort of thing. So what we've ended up now is a single information management function, which sits alongside project management, commercial management, asset management. What that means is that each of the activities within the process is assigned to a party, and then it's up to that party to then work out what roles they want within that. So you're now, if you're you'll just be as an appointed party, you'll be assigned responsibility for a number of activities within the process. You can then choose whatever you want to call those roles, okay, within your own organisation. All right, so all now just comes under one information management function. Next, we've got project information requirements, and this really, for those of you who remember plain language questions but didn't quite understand what they were, all this means is the questions that need to be answered at each stage of the delivery phase in order to make an informed decision are now just called project information requirements. Okay, that sit alongside your organisational information requirements, your asset information requirements, collated into a contractual set as your exchange information requirements. We've also now got the project's information standard. So in BS 1192, you'll be familiar with the term standards, methods and procedures. Methods and procedures are still up to the delivery team to work out what the most effective methods and procedures are to produce the information, but the standards bit has now been elevated at a project level, because we were still finding that each delivery team were working to their own set of standards. When they've tried to exchange information, it became a problem. So the information standard is now agreed at the project level. There's a few other documents, so things like the delivery team mobilisation plan. So that mobilisation activity, which is probably the most important one, pre-appointment, as it's now known, when you're putting your BIM execution plan together and you're assessing the capability and capacity of the delivery team, any shortfalls in that, you're able to then put into a delivery team mobilisation plan to say, should we be successful, these are the activities that we're going to undertake during the mobilisation stage. And that can include things like recruitment, co-location, procuring new technologies, software, whatever it might be. Okay, so it gives more information to the appointing party to make an informed selection. In terms of the BIM and the whole sort of thing, a lot of it and information management is risk-based. We talk about risk quite a lot, but we never really actually assess it or manage it. So there's now a requirement for an information delivery risk assessment. Anything that's going to be potential risk in terms of the timely delivery of the information. So there are a few, I think, is that it? Yeah. So there are a few of the new terms that have come in. So as I say, when you look at the standards, it will be very familiar to you. It looks slightly different, okay, but as I say, the main concepts and principles are still there. So what if you're already using the UK 1192 series? So if you are, you'll be using the parts, well, BS 1192 and then parts 1 to 6, okay? As from January this month, you'll continue to use part 3, 4, 5 and 6, but BS 1192 and PAS 1192 part 2 have now been withdrawn because you can't have two competing standards, and they've been replaced by ISO 19650 part 1 and part 2 and the UK National Annex. We've also produced PD 19650 part 0, which is the transitional guidance. So this is only really relevant for those of you who have already adopted the 1192 series, because it helps, or hopefully, it'll help you map from 1192 to 19650. So the obvious question is, what about the other standards in the 1192 series? So at the moment, 3, 4, 5 and 6 are still current, and you'll still be required to implement those as part of BIM level 2 or whatever it is that you're working on. But at the moment, in production, we're elevating part 3 and part 5 to the ISO 19650 series. So part 3, looking at the operational phase of assets, and part 5 is looking at the adoption of a security-minded approach for the management of information relating to sensitive assets. Which leaves part 4 and 6. Part 4, don't quite know what's going to happen with that. Basically, part 4, for those who don't know, contains a standardized structure for asset data to be exchanged with the appointing party based on a standard called COBE. Now, the part 4 is very UK specific, which means it's very difficult to get an international consensus. It's also a subset of what's called Industry Foundation Class, or IFC, which is already an international standard. So if it did get elevated, it potentially would be a competing standard to the ISO for IFCs. So we'll have to wait and see. And Part 6 has only really been produced last year, so we're still unsure as to whether that will be elevated or not. So what's that mean? So from January, you've got Parts 1 and 2 and 3 to 6. From next year, some point, Part 3 and Part 5 will be withdrawn, replaced with ISO 19650 Part 3 and Part 5, and at the moment, Part 4 and 6 will remain. Now, obviously, there's a lot of changes going on, and I think I'm really pleased that sort of the three major sort of parties involved in the production of guidance have agreed to work together. So we've got the BSI, the UK BIM Alliance, and the Centre for Digital Built Britain, who've agreed to work together to produce what's called the ISO 19650 guidance framework. I think this will probably end up being an online resource, but what that's going to do is to help provide for anybody who's just either starting or experienced to collate all the guidance and lessons learned and best practice about how to implement these standards, okay, as a single point of reference. So hopefully that'll be later this year, but it'll be an ongoing thing as more and more knowledge is gained. So to summarize then, the ISO 19650 was driven by the international community. Okay, it wasn't a case of the UK thinking they're the bee's knees. It was developed by an international working group. Okay, although it's based on the UK series, it was gained an international consensus. The concepts and principles, although we've done some restructuring, some terms have changed, the fundamental concepts and principles for the management of information within the UK 1192 series are firmly in place. Each region can create their own national annex, which is not ideal, I accept. And for those of you who work on multiple regions, it does mean that you're going to have to sort of, you can align your business processes to 19650, but then you're going to have to familiarise yourself with the different national annexes. BS 1192 and PAS 1192 Part 2 have now been withdrawn. Okay, so but if you're using it on a project, that's fine. Okay, it's now all it means is that it's just being withdrawn as a standard from by BSI. And Parts 3 and 5 will be published hopefully next year. And keep an eye out for the guidance framework, okay, which is going to be produced by BSI, UK BIM Alliance, and the Centre for Digital Built Britain. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, we've got a 10-minute presentation for myself now, and then we'll maybe take all questions at the end, either to Paul or any questions to myself. So just jump back across. So yes, Paul mentioned in the National Annex to 19650 Part 2, one of the attributes for the information containers is a classification. And in the UK National Annex, that's Uniclass. So I thought because we've got Paul here, it might make good sense to sort of link it up with a short Uniclass class presentation as well. So for those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Stephen Hamil, Innovation Director here at NBS. And this year is the 20th year I've worked on MBS products. So I think back in 1999, I joined Newcastle University working on some of the software for MBS before we came down here sort of full time. So we're going to look at three things: a little introduction to Uniclass, how it's being used now in industry. So over the last 12, 18 months or so, some sort of practical examples, and then finish off how we use it here in the MBS offerings. So as a bit of an introduction to Uniclass, it's a classification system built on the ISO 12006 Part 2 framework that's now got over 13,000 classifications in 11 different tables. And those tables are to represent like digital objects and activities of different scales, from the largest of things like complexes down to the smallest of things like screws and bolts and light bulbs. And And the three main things from that 12006 Part 2 framework is it's a digital representation of objects. It covers the entire built environment, so not just buildings, but buildings and infrastructure. And there's a common convention across every table. So you haven't got a different convention from spaces that you do to activities to that you do from products. And if you look at the common convention for these larger items, a lot of it's by sort of industry sector. So you know that if you're looking at spaces, locations, entities, complexes in the transport area, so roads, rail, they're all in that category 80. If you're looking at houses and residential, it's all in the category 45. So when you're comparing your spaces and buildings, it's all got that initial code. As you get to the smaller items, like elements, functions, systems, it's broadly around sort of fabric and function. Because a school might have a staircase, a prison might have a staircase, a hospital might have a staircase. You don't want to have separate classifications for different staircases for different sectors. So you'll see that all stairs and ramps are in the 35s. All paving, so whether that's paving around a building or a road surface, is in section 30. In terms of how this relates to 19650, in the ISO's Part 1 and Part 2, when it talks about classification, you probably can't read that, but it says it must be a classification that is based on the 12006 Part 2 framework. And then it goes one step further in the National Annex, which explicitly says shall be Uniclass 2015. All of these classification codes are free to download from the Uniclass website. So you can download them in Excel format. You can get an API key, and if you've got software developers, stream them directly. And there's a nice little widget where you can just type in codes, type in titles, and see what comes up from those 13,000 classifications. So I wanted to pick a little example which is local to the North East. So if you look at Newcastle Airport, and I've done a little search there for AIR, and you'll see an entire complex, which includes the landing strip, the aircraft standing areas, the buildings, the landscape areas. That complex is CO for complex, and then 80 because it's in the transport sector. If you go to that smaller level, and we start looking at spaces and locations, deliberately called spaces and locations because maybe people think of spaces as inside buildings, where a location like a park or the example there, an aircraft standing area, could be outside, more to do with infrastructure. Again, you see that in a different table, so SL for spaces and locations, but still in the 80 category, because that particular location's to do with the transport sector. Getting smaller again, going to elements and functions. There's two examples of barriers in green. It's quite handy having Google Maps just to take a photograph of what's here in terms of looking at the assets for Newcastle Airport. And you can see here barriers, which could be things like the barrier keeping the jet blast away from the building, or stopping children jumping over the fence and getting on the air runway itself. And then getting smaller and smaller, there's your jet blast deflection system. That's now in the SS table for systems, and it's in category 25 because it's a wall or a barrier. And then ultimately down to the products that are typically supplied by a manufacturer, and in this case the deflector screen, that's part of the deflector system. So consistent classifications for buildings and infrastructure from the largest of items down to the smallest. Creative Commons license, free to use. When the first versions of Uniclass came out in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, it was actually a book you had to pay for. But now it's completely digital, free to use online. Building example that you maybe typically see with annotations. This is part of a dining building, which is part of a hotel complex. The spaces that the activities take part in will be separated by major elements like floors and roofs and walls. They create the spaces, public toilets, outdoor dining areas, and then those major elements are broken down into the systems, like a structural system, a cladding system, or a wall lining system. And the systems themselves are made up from products typically supplied by manufacturers. So that cladding system there has got particle board, carrier rails, insulation, etc. And that's true for service engineering systems like a heating system made up of a boiler, copper pipes, and air curtains and heat emitters. So that's the basic principle, pretty much a code for everything that's in the built environment. That can be used for asset management, for briefing, for analysis, for annotations, for specifications, for FM, whatever your purpose, whatever your role is in the construction industry. If you want to look at some examples, like MBS are the publishers of Uniclass, but if you want to see examples of how it's being used at the moment in industry, particularly by UK government, there's the Centre for Digital Build Britain, two publications on asset management, asset analysis, one for buildings. This was authored by Bryden Wood on behalf of Centre for Digital Build Britain. And it looks at how they've analysed the different activities that go into those sort of major building types, like hospitals, schools, prisons. So those sort of spider diagrams is breaking down the activities in different building types, and then going down into, okay, what are the buildings and the complexes, what are the different elements, all the way down again. This example, healthcare space, down to the sort of wall linings, creating enough space for the services to get behind there and enough points to power the equipment in the healthcare space. So that was published, I think, early last year. And then 5 or 6 months later, they did pretty much the same publication, but for the infrastructure sector audience. And they used Crossrail as an example. So I think that's some examples of analysing the activities and spaces and locations for Elizabeth Line, with some sort of genuine case study examples. But instead of going down to a wall lining, it's a tunnel lining. And you can see the comparison between the classifications, whether it's a building project or infrastructure. Whereas previously, 6 or 7 years ago, you'd have a different classification table for civils work and a different classification table for buildings work. So concrete would have 2 classifications, but it's concrete, whichever it is. And then it seems at the moment, every 3 or 4 months, we hear of a different international client government group that's saying, we've analysed what classification systems they are in the world, and we've decided to mandate Uniclass. So we've heard that from some Irish groups, and some Canadian government groups are looking at it. This publication and associated guidance documents is in the public domain now in Australia, Transport for New South Wales. I think the main consultants that led this were AECOM, but yeah, for infrastructure projects, for Transport for New South Wales, consultants will use Uniclass 2015. And in their guidance documents, completely independently of NBS, they've got their little examples here for the Sydney light rail system. Going from the overall complex, there is a sort of map of like an underground light rail system overground, down to the locations, down to the individual systems and products to provide the power there. And before Christmas, I was over in Japan and just wondering, like, is it going to take a life of its own and then sort of push across the world now? Could you have one classification code to represent the digital item no matter where you are? So whether you're speaking Spanish or speaking English, whether you're speaking North American English and you call it a restroom rather than a toilet, a standpipe instead of a dry riser, that's valid Japanese. I got it checked. But that's public toilets in Japanese. So you'd have that same code, but wherever you are in the world. I guess we'll see. We'll see on that one. And we realise that lots of people have got lots of data in databases going back 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So at MBS, we've worked with other publishers of information. So all in terms of the scope of what's covered for RICS NRM1, in terms of sort of early stage estimating for buildings, we work with the RICS to get mappings from the relevant systems to the relevant NRM code. And we're doing some work at the moment follows on a little bit from an Innovate UK project to see it's mainly with the products table, but a few systems as well, mapping from the Uniclass codes to the SFG20 and the IFC classes and subclasses. This is a nice example with a one-to-one mapping, but occasionally it's one-to-many as well. And then just to show examples of how we're using it in our products as well, because we're maintaining Uniclass, offering it to the industry for free. And part of the reason we're doing that is because it helps us. At MBS, we are information publishers, and we need some way to publish our information in a structured format. So I'm just going to use two examples here. The first is in terms of the BIM objects that we deliver. We published a BIM object standard that looks at all of the best-in-class techniques from around the world. And in particular, inside our BIM object standard, we look at how you should name the properties, what's the naming convention, what properties are needed as a sort of default. And again, this is all on our website if you'd like to check it out. But if you have a look just at this little example, we've got 7 or 8 doors here from 7 or 8 manufacturers plus an MBS generic door. And because it's all been authored to a standard set of properties, you'll see that everything has the Uniclass code, Uniclass title there. We extended further to have a standard naming convention for the Kobe properties, and we've also got the IFC properties as well. So if you read that UK Annex to 19650 Part 2, when it talks about open data formats for information exchanges, it lists IFC and Kobe. Now, if you've got to generate IFC and Kobe files and you haven't got standardized information in your models, it's going to be like a hell of a manual job. Whereas at the start of the project, in your project information standard, if you can say all objects will have the following naming conventions and properties inside, then you've got a real chance of automating that. Else you're just doing the 3D modeling side to generate your drawings and do crash detection. If you want to focus on the information transfer that you can extract from these fantastic 3D models, that's a conversation to have right at the start in the project information standard of your project or across your organization. It's worth saying that there's about 10,000 free to use objects on National BIM Library to help you get going. We can't cover every single product that goes into a building or a project, but there's a lot there, and then you can supplement that with objects you create yourself. And we'd recommend you create those to that NBS BIM object standard that pulls together the best standards from around the world. And the second example I'd like to use is our newly launched specification product. This is MBS Chorus. You might have seen some banners downstairs and outside, but all of the specification content in here is now Uniclass 2015 out the box. It's a cloud-based product, so you don't have to install it on your desktop anymore. Helps project teams come together and collaborate. But if you look at this little example here, I'm going into the specification, architectural spec, and you'll see everything's either a system or a product. And then you can just quickly filter to say, show me all the SS30s, which is all like the ceilings and soffits, and then drop it down to SS3025. And there's your 4 types of ceiling systems. So you've got 3 types of unit, 1 board suspended, and you can get that information straight away, either in the product or once you've exported that out to the supply chain. If you're just interested in products, there's all of your fastener products under PR20. And if you want to go more specifically, you're getting down there to your staples, your washers, whichever systems they serve. So I'm clicking on that staple and it's telling me the relationship between that product and the system is it happens to be the stainless steel roof covering system. If that staple is used by a different system, this specification system manages the relationships between the tables. So the classification doesn't do the relationship between, say, a ceiling and insulation. That's the modeling tool, which could be the specification tool or the 3D modeling tool. So got lots of information on our website about the Chorus and where we see the future of specification going, how it aligns to things like 19650. So if you're interested in that, have a look on our website. Maybe have a chat with one of the MBS staff later on. One last thing I'd like to talk about when it comes to Uniclass is governance and maintenance. What we didn't want to do, or the government when it initially sort of funded it, wanted to do, was to do a bit of work for 6 months and then just leave it for 10 years, because things change. So if that had happened 15 years ago, you'd not have classifications maybe for solar heating and living wall and green roof, etc., etc. So Uniclass gets maintained. So if you go to our website, you'll see something like the systems table. It's had 12 revisions now. And we try not to change classifications, only in very rare situations, but we keep adding to them. And what allows us to add it to is buy-in from the big clients. So in this example here, environment agencies suggested additional classifications we need for their jobs. It's the same with the police have been suggesting. We're getting from Australia, Transport for New South Wales, Transport for London, Network Rail, Highways England. We have Sarah Delaney, one of our technical authors, who's head of classification. And about 50%, 60% of her role is just managing these relationships, seeing the requirements for the classifications, and then putting them in the right tables, in the right slots. So it's not a thing that's just been done and is going to be left alone for 20 years. It really is responding to the industry's need. So just a little summary, and then we'll open up questions from myself and Paul at the front. Uniclass 2015, a classification system for BIM. And it's their UK National Annex for part 2. And the industry usage is growing. It's not going to be a click of your fingers and every project moves across, but it's been like amazing just seeing more and more people using it over the last 2 or 3 years. And pleased to say from an MBS point of view, it's now ingrained in our sort of premium offerings, National BIM Library and associated manufacturer offerings, and also our flagship specification product, NBS Chorus. So I'm going to invite Paul up to the front again. Please keep on engaging online, social media. I know people will be watching this on Twitter, so #DiscoverMBS if anyone's got anything to put on social media. But also, please just pop your hand up, say who you are, and then direct a question either at Paul or myself.